feel very far away from you, but I think that the microphone will straddle the gap. Now, I hope this helps the project, but I want to talk about precisely starting off changes really in the 20th century, spilling over into our century in the West, because that's what I've studied carefully. But I can't stop myself there, because when you think through these, then you can see immediately connections outside the West. And so I want to give a rather long and maybe rambling talk, but I hope the thread is going to be clear throughout. Well, first of all, let me talk about the changes that form the background to the developments in religion and spirituality in the West, because there are long-term changes that really are an essential part of the background of the changes that happened in the 20th century. And first of all, I'd like to mention two developments that sort of could go under the title disenchantment. Now, I'd like to say, perhaps before all that, though, that religion is a very unstable category. It won't stay still. It's moving all the time. And its definition by contrast to other aspects of human life is also very porous, right? So we tend not to know that in the West because we've developed a political and social set of organizations and culture and understanding which we divide up into spheres. There's a political sphere, a sphere of art, a sphere of culture, a sphere of religion, and so on. And we've actually made a point of separating the political from the religious, separation of church and state, and so on. But if you go back into other periods and societies in history, to ancient Rome and so on, I mean, try to separate the political from the religious. Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, and you have all these interweavings of them. As Roger Caillois, the famous French philosopher, said, in very early societies, la religion est partout. Religion is everywhere. It's all mixed in. So I want to have that in the back of our minds, and I want to recur at several moments to ways in which the category is still very unstable, and when you try to pin it down, it begins to wiggle away from you. All right, so let's look at these developments, which I think you can use the Weberian term disenchantment for, Entsalbung, right? The first one is one that we're quite familiar with. It's really the one that, in a way, justifies the title in German, which means demagification, right? The decline, if you like, of magic. We have the book, Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas. That is the decline of an understanding of the world, in which is full of spirits and forces which you have to either placate or fend off, spirits of the woods and so on. And this is not just a set of theories. I want to argue it's a certain sensibility. People live these as actual things they experience, or as they see themselves experiencing. And we in Western culture have become more and more, if you like, insensitive to this. We don't really understand it anymore. We've abandoned the beliefs that would underpin it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one very important background development, which is the basis for 20th century evolution in religion. And the second kind of disenchantment is maybe not the right word for that, but the understanding that 400 or 500 years ago, or even more recently, our ancestors had of the order of society, the political order, the social order of society, being in some way embedded in an order of the cosmos. I mean, you think of the standard understanding of the French monarchy up till the Revolution, and you have the orders of being in the cosmos, higher and lower, the orders of society, the clergy, the aristocracy, and so on, are, as it were, mapped onto these orders. So you don't have a system in which you can just decide, well, let's rearrange all this, which, of course, what the French Revolution tried to do. Let's abolish these distinctions altogether. That understanding which we all share today, that all the existing regimes were at one point or another set up by nameable historical figures, and with certain intentions, and then they underwent these changes and so on. That idea that it's all done by us or disposable or up to us to do is something which is very foreign to the understanding of our ancestors not so very long ago. Well, there's not only this idea of the social order being in some way embedded in the cosmic order, but also another very common idea of the law that defines our society as going back, people often said, since time out of mind, right? It's not something you can ever escape from. This law, it frames us, whether we like it or not, which is why you see the early modern revolutions as backward looking. I mean, you have this idea in England of the ancient constitution, and the king has usurped power from parliament, and we have to fight the king in order to reestablish the order of things. So what's going on in what people call a revolution was getting back to the original structure, which was always valid, always were morally, legally valid, but had been departed from. So you get this evolution, as you know, I mean, if you know, of the word revolution. The 1688 Glorious Revolution was, in the original image, the way the planets revolve, you get it back to the original position, right? So it was a return to the original position. 100 years later, you have the French Revolution, which self-consciously sees itself as innovating. And now we take that to be the meaning of the term. But it's interesting that in history, it wasn't. Okay, so there you get another big change, the understanding of our world, our political world, our social world, as ordered by certain historically nameable figures who set these things up, and it can be changed and so on. Now we have something like this idea of remaining within a legal order within these structures. So Canadian Supreme Court, US Supreme Court are always concerned with deciding, what really follows from the Constitution. In our case, 82 is not very long ago. What follows from the Constitution for this case and that case. But it's always something as Pierre Trudeau in our case, who set all this up. All right, this is part of the deep background. Now, I want to get to the 20th century changes, and these are harder to define, and I probably haven't got it entirely right. I'm sure I haven't. But I want to talk about two kinds of unbundling. This is a very awkward word. It doesn't exist in anybody's vocabulary, but I'm trying to get at something. What am I trying to get at? Well, there are two kinds. One kind is this. In Western society, if you go back far enough, you go back to the medieval church, succeeded in many European societies by national confessional churches, and in some cases, of course, in the Anglo-Saxon development, it already began to fracture into many denominations, and in the US it fractured quite considerably. But as where we stand now, in Quebec, we had that kind of, if you like, confessional society in French Canada up until 1960, right? What do I mean by that? I mean that there is thought to be normal that your belongings are multiple and overlapping. You're belonging to this nation, you're belonging to this church, you're belonging to this kind of civilization, your acceptance of a certain moral order. All these belongings go naturally together. And this would be the same kind of thing would exist in Scandinavian Lutheran churches and in certain German Lutheran or Catholic areas, etc., or until the revolution and so on in France, etc., etc. So we get this idea that the norm is this kind of bundling of belongings. Now, as against that, we exist now in a world in which lots of people are, they're Quebecois or they're Canadian, so they're bound to a certain group of people by that, but then they also have a certain religious or spiritual or non-spiritual, anti-spiritual views. They're bound to a completely different group of people by that. They have certain moral views which are quite unlike those accepted by the political group and the religious group, and so on, and so on, and so on. This becomes a situation which was not unlike situations in other civilizations, which nevertheless are different in a way I want to describe later, but a situation in which you have this kind of, the French word éclatement comes to mind, everything breaks apart, and what I call the Nova effect. People are off, not on their own, because they're always linked with somebody else in their political life, in their religious life, and so on. But these somebody else's, these groups don't overlap at all. They're different. The second kind of unbundling goes with the first, and it's really something of this kind. This kind, within these large national churches, it was normal, let's say in the parish, Quebec parish, before 1960, within the life of a religious denomination, there are immense number of activities. I mean, there is going to the liturgy every Sunday. There are caritative activities, in which you're helping so-and-so, and there's a sodality of Mary praying. There are people organizing pilgrimages to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré. There are, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these different activities. Some people just go in for some people go more into deeper kinds of devotion, so they're devotional groups, but the bundling here is that all that is carried on within this same structure. It's another facet that goes along with the first kind of bundling. And there again, the situation today is an unbundled one. That is, I may belong to a church, for instance, for purposes of praying people, but I may have a meditation practice which is completely unconnected with that. My caritative activity is through Médecins Sans Frontières or Save the Children, and so on and so on and so on. Things which were all done under the same umbrella before, now done very differently. Now this kind of society is one in which, I'll look at it from a third point of view very quickly, what we're coming out of is a kind of Christendom structure. Christendom, I take the meaning of this word to be a civilization in which the political structure, the artistic life, the cultural life, and so on, are all informed by the Christian faith. But I mean, this same kind of bundling could happen in a Muslim society. It would be, there isn't a word. There's a word, yeah, Islamicate, if you like, and so on. But this kind of situation is another way of talking about the bundled world. So what we're living in now is a decay of Christendom, a move out of Christendom, and that, I think, is a very significant. Mounier had wrote a brilliant book in 1945, Emmanuel Mounier, Feu la chrétienté, the late Christendom, and he was extremely perspicacious about this. Okay, so we get a world. How did this world come about? Well, it's been preparing for a long time, but it accelerated, the development accelerated in the 60s. So it really, that period in the second half of the 20th century. And you get, and I mean, it's very, very difficult to, but I'll say a few things just to indicate some of the forces that seem to be in play here. That there came to be an increased sense of individuality and individual life, which is partly expressed and partly entrenched by what I've called the ethic of authenticity. The idea that everybody has their own way of being human, you've got to do your own thing in the common expression. But it also was obviously made possible by modern prosperity, by the consumer society, by the breakup of various kinds of solidarity that existed before. I mean, think, for instance, of how in the post-war period, modes of working class solidarity in certain European societies, unions and parties and so on, tended to fracture. People went off on their own. So you get certain kinds of individualism which are at the same time interwoven with and strengthened by a new ethical idea, in this case, the ethic of authenticity. Or again, another facet of all this, of course, was the, if you like, sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, right, which reflected something of the same kind of breakout into individually individually designed life, as it were, not accepting the traditional ethical boundaries that people were meant to respect. And you get an interweaving of the sexual revolution and the authenticity revolution, and this produced very interesting new phenomena. I mean, I just want to reflect on this for a minute. If you think of the gay rights movement and its incredible thrust forward since then, unprecedented in history, I think you can see how this marriage of the two, of a revolution aiming to liberate or make possible certain forms of sexual orientation, activity, etc., on one hand, authenticity on the other hand, gave tremendous force to those demands. So if you go back to André Gide in the 1920s and 30s, who, to the pain of many of his friends, like Paul Claudel and so on, came out of the closet. And he came out of the closet because he was deeply impressed by the senseless and needless suffering imposed on homosexuals by the restrictions of the society that they lived in. There was this sense of, well, this is terrible, the suffering, it just can't go on. What drove the gay rights movement was something not different from that totally, but another angle, which was the idea that being gay was an identity. And identities have to be respected. You can't discriminate, right? So that gave a tremendous power to these demands. And we see the results in our time. Okay, so there we have got a picture of a society in which, as I try to put it in the Secular Age book, I'm using a distinction by an American sociologist, Robert Withnaw, who talks about the distinction between seekers in religion and spirituality and dwellers, people who are happy to be within their community and their church, the dwellers and people who are looking. And the proportion of seekers in our Western society has immensely increased, right? But now, this is not without reaction. This has not come about without a reaction in which a lot of people who were rather happier in the Christendom mode of living their faith are deeply shaken, feel that their world is being upset, feel that all boundaries are disappearing, that all benchmarks are going, their kind of way of life is threatened. So you get a very strong reaction in some circles against this, if you like, fragmentation of religiously unified societies. Now, this reaction builds on something which in a way comes from deep in the background of our societies. That is, when we get to period after the French Revolution, roughly, in which what I call in the book the age of mobilization, in which it's commonly understood that political entities are formed by mobilizing people around a certain identity. You know, we are the peuple français, or this nation, and we have to get our own state or get our freedom from that other dominating empire, right? So you have to mobilize people around these identities. And this mobilization, sometimes did a lot to produce the first consciousness of that identity. If you look at the map of Eastern Europe, you see these areas in which from village to village, as you move from Prague through to Bratislava and beyond, there's a slightly different dialect and so on. Well, in this world of mobilization, elites come in and say, no, these people speak Czech, and those people speak Slovak, and those people speak Ukrainian, and those people speak Polish, and the languages are standardized and made. So you get the age of mobilization when people are mobilized into an identity as the basis of their political life. And very often, identities need markers, and very often the marker was religious or confessional. Just think of Catholicism in Poland, Catholicism in Ireland, Catholicism here, right, as examples of that. So already the bundled world produced a modern phenomenon of the mobilized national state or national people seeking the state, which was predicated on that, some version of that bundling, right? So the present, if you like, what looks like fragmentation of a world of seekers runs up against both a very powerful reaction among people who are very devoted, I mean, have a great sense of devotion and piety, that the religion is being lost. But at the same time, this overlaps with other people who have a fear of losing their national identity, right? Because people are breaking away from a kind of a sense of belonging connected to the basic markers. So we get in the late 20th century, or it becomes evident in the late 20th century, a great gamut of reactions against what's happening around us, and wherever it is, in which people are reacting to defend a collective marker of identity, sometimes because of a genuine piety towards the religion or denomination which is part of that marker, sometimes even in the absence of that, purely historically. I'll give you examples from both ends of the spectrum, okay? So when Yugoslavia breaks up and the issue becomes terribly tense, what are the parts of the ex-state which are going to be held by Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks, right? Then you get this tremendous reference back to the religious historical markers. So an atheist like Milosevic is talking about the terrible defeat at Kosovo Polje and what this means to the Serbs, right? And you get the kind of mobilization around a faith position which is, anyway, for a lot of the people mobilizing, not something that they're actively devout about, but something that they can bring everyone together around. Or I mean, Northern Ireland could be, to some extent, another example of that. The BJP in India is an extraordinary example of that. I mean, they manipulate really genuine piety, but the original intellectual Savarkar was an atheist, right? And I suspect Modi. Anyway, we can talk about that later. So you have on that end of the spectrum, this kind of historical mobilization. And we'll come back to the Quebec case as a certain example of that too. On the other end of the spectrum, you get Islamism, right? Which is, the whole movement of the idea that Islam can give us the basis for a modern state. And it really is animated by a very powerful, not only Islamic identity, but a very powerful sense of devotion here. So we get a very complex set of reactions. And what I want to say is that our societies are in danger of being riven by conflict between a certain kind of understanding of what it is to have a spiritual, or anti-spiritual, or spiritual, or religious and so position among others who don't share that, certain understanding of that, which is the one which goes along with the idea that we are all seekers, and which very often leads to a very, positive sense of relating to people in difference, really trying to understand them and living with them on one hand. And on the other hand, you have movements in which the sense that all this is making something slip away, either on the identity level or on the level of religious devotion and practice, which is terribly unacceptable and has to be fought against. And where these come together, where there's a mixture between a sense of the religion is threatened, which is also a sense that an identity is threatened, you get very, very strong reactions. I think if I can take the case of gay marriage and so on again, and contrast the United States and Canada, you can see that, happening there. In the United States, there's this tremendous agony over this change and the slow admission of gay rights and so on. In Canada, a lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people were very offended by it. A lot of people felt bad about it, but it hasn't really shaken our society. And why is that? Well, I think it's because America, as a U.S., is a very powerful nationalist sentiment, but it has this deep disagreement among different parts of the population. What is it around? Is it really a Christian country, or is it not? I mean, something that goes beyond that and is based on, separation of church and state and so on. And the sense of violation of the national identity is, I think, what makes the American debate so incredibly intense and angry, see? And you hear Americans on the right talking about taking back the country. I mean, where does it go? Okay, so we have this set of developments in the West, which I tried to give a rough characterization of, which end up being complex in the sense that you can see a lot of things moving towards one kind of pattern, let's say pattern of religious or spiritual coexistence of difference, which is marked by the domination of, or importance of seekers and the kind of ethic of mutual comprehension that tends to arise there on one hand, and on the other hand, a sense that things are slipping, that we have to return, really a desire not to abandon the Christendom perspective, to keep it as much as possible in the center of how we operate. So now, let's look at some of the phenomena that reflect this. I've already mentioned U.S. and Canada contrast, but I mean, let's look at what happens here. What role, why does religion play a very important role in a lot of the debates and discussions around, which we see today around immigration? And this, I think, ought to puzzle us more than we are puzzled by it, right? So you have in any society taking in immigrants, you have an initial reaction by the Québécois de souche, you call it, old stock, I mean, the people who are there a long time. Something new is here, it's going to change us, it's very worrying. That's absolutely normal. If you look at long-standing immigrant societies like Canada and the States, we got, the Americans got all excited about the Irish in the 1840s, maybe we shouldn't give them, and the happy ending is if you get beyond that. We got, how we treated the East Asians, in Vancouver and so on. It's better not even talk about this today, but we have to remember what we did, and now it seems bizarre and strange maybe to many people. So we go through these immigrant societies receiving immigrants go through these waves in which they have a challenge, and if everything goes well, they overcome it and they integrate the population descended from the old stock people and the new immigrants. Now, all the way through the West, a large part of the West, Islam is causing tremendous waves, tremendous fear and so on. Now, that's partly explained by the geopolitical situation. It's certainly aggravated by that. But it isn't simply that. Let me give you an example of Quebec, right? That here, it's focused mainly on Muslims now, but the cultural fear was originally triggered off by, if you like, unfamiliar religions in general. Let me remind Québécois, and let me inform non-Québécois, that what got the public opinion really going in 2006, mobilized by the Action démocratique du Québec, was the famous decision by the Supreme Court upholding the arrangement made between the school and some Sikh parents that the kirpan would be allowed to be worn, but it would be sewn into the the suit of the kid so that he couldn't, a moment of anger, take it out. And that was finally agreed by the Supreme Court. There was tremendous emotion about that. I mean, where is this going to end? As you know, Gérard Bouchard and I went around the province talking about this, and it really is very, very educative because you get a feeling for what the emotions are. People come again and again, say the same kind of things. You get the feeling of the fear. Where is this going to end? Is this going to change us? Are we going to be, completely overturned? And then you get, particularly in the wake of our own quiet revolution, our own setting aside of certain religious interdictions and so on, the sense, well, they're going to come and reverse all that, right? I remember someone saying, the Muslims are going to reverse the equality of men and women and so on. And I remember Jean Boussard saying to somebody, well, look, there are Muslims, it's about, 1.5% of Quebecers, only 60% of the Muslims in Quebec practice at all, etc. So, how are they going to do this? And she said, "Mais quand même." She's perplexed, but the feeling is there. Okay, and I think the only way of being able to operate well with this, I think you have to have a great deal of sympathy and get the feel of this and understand why. If you've never seen any of these people before and haven't dealt with them and haven't exchanged with them, it can be very threatening. Why does it get coded always as religion? See, here's where the category is so unstable, right? Because I said earlier that, quoting Roger Caillois, la religion est partout, in certain societies, in certain very old established societies, in certain small village communities, the line between custom and religion, people don't make it. Everything that belongs to the customs is part of the religious life of the society. So something like honor killing, for some of the people who do it, they would think of this somehow as religious. But what is religion here? Is it what the imam in Al-Azhar Mosque will say is, required? In which case honor killing is not, and female genital mutilation is not. But you see, so we're on the kind of borderline. Why does it get coded as religion? And I think it gets coded as religion for two reasons. Number one, that it's very hard for people to say in our present context, your culture worries me. Please go away, or do that in private, but don't offend me. That sounds wrong. But if you say, these people are violating a fundamental principle of our society, namely laïcité, and then it's all right. But the same goes for the other side, if you like. If you want to ask for a holiday, and you aren't going to say, well, my family always, always goes off on Saturday, etc. So please, no, you're going to say, I'm going to look up the charter and say the things that you can plead as a reason for reasonable accommodation, and religion is going to be one of them. So you get the drawing of these disputes around the most, if you like, psychologically non-negotiable terrain of religion. And so you get religion becoming salient again. But there also is this other reason I mentioned earlier, you see, that the religion, even for people who have walked out of the church or whatever it is an historic marker for them. And that's what brings about what many of you might have thought was the odd phenomenon of Parti Québécois presenting the Quebec Charter, which was meant to really put restrictions on all these weird practices, right? But you can't do that in the public service. But the crucifix over the Speaker's chair in the National Assembly, well, and when people challenged Madame Marois about that, oh, ça c'est le patrimoine, c'est pas la religion. So, but all this was one, and Gérard and I felt this very extraordinary ambivalence throughout the discussions, that people were very angry about what the curé had done and so on. But at the same time, they realized that their historic identity was connected in some way. See? So anyway, so you get this tremendous complication of the place of religion, and it's becoming, once again, a terrible source of conflict and of anger and so on, which we can only hope to overcome to the extent that people get to meet each other and know each other. You see, it's interesting that in certain schools in Montreal where the kids go to school with Muslim kids and so on, it's the case of my own grandchildren, they couldn't understand. We always thought adults were crazy, but now this is going too far. They couldn't understand what the whole problem was about. But if you, okay, so let's try to look at how this situation of religion in its conflicted form, a form of conflict between these two modes of living religious life in the West, relates to what exists outside the West. And I think you can see certain contexts in non-Western societies which come to resemble the present context in the West. First of all, globalizing cities, right? Like, Mumbai, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and so on, and the ones we know, London, New York, have this tremendous gamut of different religious and spiritual and non-religious positions, because the people just come in from just about anywhere. They come in from abroad, in the upper echelons, but they come in from the countryside and the villages around, from many different sources in the society. So you have, people try to add them up, and I can never have a memory for figures, extraordinary in New York. It's an extraordinary gamut. And when I say religions, I mean not just the famous ones you know about, but tribal religions from the Amazon, or some kind of, there is a religion which is a marriage of a certain form of Afro-Brazilian religion with an Amazonian religion, which now has followers in Tokyo. And I mean, it's really, we're living in a world at the level of, if you like, globalized cities, where it's the seekers in spades, in a certain sense, people are side by side. And in the same time, you can be living in a city like Mumbai, where the Marathi majority, well, not all of them, but I mean, many of them can be mobilized by the Shiv Sena, this is our land, and so on. So, particularly with hostility towards Muslims. So you get the same kind of conflict, analogous kind of conflict to the one we're seeing in our societies being played out there. And then there are other societies in which you have a quite different religious picture, also very much based on searching and reconstituting of new forms. Take a society like Korea, or in another way, China, where there is, in Korea, a kind of dominant historical, Confucianism. What is Confucianism? That's another place where they attempt to draw the boundaries or it breaks down, right? But anyway, whatever it is. But there is in that new kind of society people who are searching for some kind of personal religion. So they're going to Buddhism in many cases, they're going to various kinds of Christianity. For different reasons, something similar is happening in China, right? So you get tremendous variety of cases in which this kind of pluralism is growing before our eyes, right? And in the case of China, of course, this is the state is terrorized of this, losing control of this, so they really try to control it from the center. And then we get the religion as a marker of national mobilization very powerfully in certain third world countries. I mean, think of Sri Lanka, think of Burma, right? It's an irony for many people that Theravada Buddhism, again, if you read the scriptures of these religions, either the gospel or the Tripitakas and so on, you can see very little warrant for the immense mobilization of the Sinhalese majority to deny the Tamils their rights, which produced the terrible reaction and so on. But nevertheless, you find this being used as a marker. And here, see, that's another place where what exactly does the term mean becomes a question for you, because here you have it's very much a reactive nationalist mobilization, right? They're, in the Sinhalese case, they're reacting against colonialism. English was the established language. What's going to be the established language now that we're independent? Is it going to be bilingual, Sinhalese, Tamil, or no? It's going to be only Sinhalese, right? So you get a nationalist reaction, or against the colonial, or if, in the case of Islamism, the sense of being controlled by Western empires and then controlled by their successors in a kind of neo-colonial relation leads to a very powerful mobilization against that. But now, this can take more than one form. It's interesting in the Arab case that first of all it took the form of a, if you like, secular ideology of Arab nationalism, either the Nasserite form or the Ba'ath Party form, right? And then with the failure of that, we get the Islamic Brotherhoods more and more taking over. Palestinian case is an interesting and very worrying case because Hamas is getting more and more space up till recently in the sense of liberation struggle, in a sense, which they feel themselves to be in. So that today, a great deal of the mobilization around Islam politically is still directed in the same direction and is, as it were, converting people from having expressed that sense of resistance to colonialism in a laïque and a secular ideology to expressing it in a religious ideology. And see, again, all sorts of questions arise. It's a religious mobilization, but this also changes the center of gravity of the religion. I mean, for instance, these mobilized forms of Islam are very hostile towards Sufism in many cases. That comes from the Wahhabi background too, but they're very hostile to Sufism, very hostile to forms of Islam which are concerned with being on a journey, developing a relation with God and so on. So that everywhere where these have been powerful, these mobilizations have been powerful, there has been pressure or danger to the point even of, in a case of another difference within Islam, of Shia being persecuted, even attacked, because they don't really fit the mold. And so we have, a mobilization around religion, but the religion doesn't remain changed. If you like, the center of gravity, recognizing that, as I said earlier, in talking about one of the unbundlings, that, great religion like Islam has an immense variety of activities of spiritual disciplines, of attempts to become better and more conformity, to submit and so on. Immense variety of these exist, and some of these are radically repressed, and the thing is radically, if you like, simplified. And what comes to be supremely important is something typical of national mobilizations, a sense of honor. They're dissing us, they don't respect us, we've got to force them to respect us. So you get this tremendous emphasis on the idea of blasphemy, which isn't always there in Islam, but it's become tremendously important. So, it's mobilized around religion, but the religion is not a kind of stable category. It's something that's itself being changed. Well, what does all this add up to? There's a lot of other things here, but let me try to pull it together. I think we're faced nowadays with a whole lot of different things, where we're faced with cases where within the great civilizations and the great religions, there is sometimes a battle, tension, tug of war, sometimes a real battle going on as to how to live this and understand this. So where in the West we have this, if you like, to simplify the way of existing of seekers plus the way that those who are very worried by the decline of Christendom want to hold things back, that kind of conflict. And within Islam, you see very clearly the tremendous battle between various forms of Islam that see that they cannot really live with this kind of mobilization. Interesting in places like Senegal, the Saudi offered money to Senegal to set up madrasas, and Senegal said no. 95% of the population is Muslim. They all belong to 4 Sufi tariqat, right? And their idea of ecumenicism is we get on together between the four brotherhoods, right? But they looked at the Saudi offer and they said no. They're going to try to bring up our kids to despise everything we've been about for the last, 300, 400 years. So they said no. So you have this battle going on. So what we have is not the famous clash of civilizations, actually, that Huntington talked about. What we have is a clash within these great civilizations and their religions about how to relate to difference, to others, including to the other civilization, right? So we in the West are fighting, I think, a battle against kind of mindless Islamophobia, which I think is spreading and we have to fight against. And they in the Muslim world are fighting against jihadism. And in a sense, the jihadis and the Islamophobes kind of help each other, right? They're objectively helping each other. And the rest of us have to somehow bring an end to this. Okay, this is, I hope it's not a totally confusing picture of evolution, but I hope it does show that there are really big changes going on in the 21st century, continuing what went on before. I haven't even begun to talk about Brazil and the kind of mutations going on there. There are really big changes going on. They're going on in a context where there's a tension between reading them as decline, as loss, as a slipping away of what we always were, and so on one hand, and reading them very positively as, yes, it's a world in which people are seeking and looking and trying to understand each other. There is a real conflict between those two readings. I think we can see this very clearly in the West, but I think we can also see this in other forms in non-Western civilizations. And in the particular case of, the West's relation to Islam, what we have is a battle within both, between two ways of dealing with the religion, in other words, we're having struggles within each civilization about whether to have a clash of civilizations, right? We haven't had it yet, but there are some forces within each that are just spoiling for a fight, right? And are dying to bring it about. And it depends on whether they succeed or not. This is the big question. And if they don't succeed, then we don't have this clash. I don't know where to end here, but you can see how maybe the case of Pakistan is maybe interesting case in point. You see, Pakistan is a society that was mobilized by people who were not, all of them, very devout. Jinnah, taking his cocktails up there in Malabar Hill in Bombay was not a very pious Muslim. And he thought, before the terrible trauma of partition, that Pakistan would be as multicultural, multi-religious as India. It would just be a different part where the Islamic cultural hegemony had existed, and they would go on as before. And yet very soon after Jinnah disappears from the scene, the Islamic identity begins to be taken in a completely different sense, application of the Sharia and so on. And you get a situation in which the very existence of diversity in Pakistan is in terrible danger and very violent form. And people are trying now to fight back from that. And it's going to be hard. But you can see how, parallel to the evolution from Arab nationalism in its Nasser-Baath form to Arab nationalism in its Islamist form, you get the evolution of Pakistani identity in its original Jinnah form to the Pakistani identity, which has emerged since, mainly through the effect of the army, mainly through the hatred of India, the army running all these jihadi organizations to make trouble in Kashmir and so on. So you get these big shifts. See, the whole category of religion, if you think of it as in a kind of ahistorical, essentialistic way, is always continuing in the same way but having different effects. You don't get to grasp the reality. What we have here is these very unstable and changing categories, also not only unstable but contested. I mean, there's a lot of people say, that's it, no, that's it, and so on. Contested categories, which are nevertheless playing this very important role, and we have to kind of find our way in this, very difficult terrain. Okay, I hope I haven't hopelessly confused everything by talking about too much at once, but let's have some questions and objections.
Thank you very much, Charles.